At 4:58 on a Friday afternoon, Grant Ellison fired me from the company I had helped protect for 9 years. At 5 o'clock, LatticePay was scheduled to certify a lending model that would decide which small businesses received instant credit. At 5:06, the board opened an email Grant had deleted 4 minutes earlier. It contained one sentence he could not explain away. Once Nora is no longer the designated control owner, the exception dies with her. It did not die with me. And that was the part he had misunderstood about the system I built. My name is Nora Hale. I was Senior Vice President of Risk Architecture at LatticePay, a Fintech company that processed payments and offered short-term working capital to small businesses. I joined when the company had 43 employees and one major client. By the time Grant fired me, we had 312 employees, $74 million in annual revenue, and a sponsor bank agreement with Harbor National that let us launch products most fintech companies our size could not offer. The trouble started with Pulse Advance, a new product Grant called our next engine. Pulse Advance used live payment data to offer approved merchants between $5,000 and $80,000 in working capital. The pilot had performed well. Harbor National approved expansion from 12,000 merchants to 120,000. But only if we completed one final risk certification by 5 p.m. on the last Friday of the quarter. That certification was mine. 3 weeks before the deadline, I sat with Grant, Chief Financial Officer Evelyn Cho, and my deputy, Caleb Ross. A dashboard glowed behind me. The seasonal merchants are distorting the estimate, Grant said. We have stronger data everywhere else. That was what made him difficult. Grant understood enough to make a weak argument sound sophisticated. The seasonal segment is 28% of the expansion population, I said. We cannot call it noise because it makes the chart uncomfortable. Evelyn folded her hands. She had the calmest voice in the company and used it most effectively when everyone else was close to raising theirs. What would you certify? She asked. A controlled expansion to 40,000 merchants, lower limits, and weekly bank review. Grant leaned back. We lose the investor window. LatticePay was negotiating a $60 million strategic investment from Redmarsh Capital. We were not desperate for rescue. The money would fund an acquisition and position Grant as the executive who transformed LatticePay from a payment processor into a complete financial platform. Caleb said, the validation report still has 3 open conditions. Conditions are not failures, Grant replied. No, Caleb said, but they are not decorations either. Caleb was 34, precise and painfully reserved. I recruited him from Harbor National because he understood models and the human tendency to treat controls as obstacles until something broke. I had also recommended him to replace me if I became Chief Risk Officer. After we renewed the Harbor agreement, Grant brought coffee to my office early one morning. On my cup, he had written 3 letters in black marker CRO. During the Pulse Advance meeting, I told Grant I would not certify full expansion on the current evidence. He did not threaten me. He became reasonable. Then run the model without merchants whose revenue is more than 40% seasonal, he said. We can address them later. That removes the population most likely to expose the weakness. It defines the launch population. After the results are known. Grant's expression tightened, then smoothed. This is why people experience risk as a department of no. Send the revised product criteria in writing, I said. I will review them against the bank agreement. Everything becomes a document with you. That is why Harbor trusts us. The next morning, Grant sent a company-wide message congratulating the product team for completing final model validation. The independent report did not say final. It said conditional. That meant the model could proceed only within agreed limits until 3 issues were resolved. I replied to Grant, Evelyn, our general counsel Martin Vale, and Caleb. For accuracy, validation remains conditional. Risk certification for full expansion has not been issued. Martin answered first. Noted. Please avoid unnecessary circulation while review is active. Grant did not respond. An hour later, my invitation to the investor preparation meeting vanished from my calendar. That afternoon, Evelyn closed my office door behind her. You corrected him in writing, she said. He made a material statement in writing. You could have called. I did. He declined. She exhaled. I agree with your substance. I am worried about your method. I had a blind spot. When I believed a risk was serious, I stopped hearing tone. I focused on accuracy, deadlines, and the record. That made me effective in difficult rooms. It also made it easy to describe me as rigid after the room was over. A product review moved without my team. A summary deck renamed the open conditions monitoring items. Martin requested my last 6 monthly reports. Evelyn began sending follow-up emails that summarized my words more sharply than I remembered speaking them. Caleb grew quiet. Twice, I found him in meetings I had not been invited to. The second time, he stepped into the hallway. I was going to tell you, he said. About the meeting or about taking my seat in it? Grant asked for continuity planning. Continuity for what? He did not say. You went anyway. Yes. He offered no explanation. That hurt more than I expected. I had put Caleb in front of the board, defended his cautious style, and told Grant he was the rare executive who could disagree without making disagreement personal. That evening, I stayed late and opened a formal exception. I labeled it RA17, Priority 1, because management wanted to expand beyond the validated population and alter eligibility after seeing the risk results. Priority 1 did not mean catastrophe. It meant an independent decision was required before execution. 2 years earlier, after a pricing control failure, the board had approved an executive override protocol. Grant supported it publicly and demanded a strong record. If management overrides a control owner, he had said, I want to know who decided, what they knew, and when they knew it. Every Priority 1 exception received a code. Any final executive directive that referenced the code was preserved in the audit vault, even if the sender later deleted the message. The system captured only communications connected to active high-level exceptions and only from designated decision-makers. The audit committee could access the vault. He had forgotten how specific it was. I attached the validation report, the proposed launch scope, and my 40,000 merchant recommendation to RA17. Then I sent it to Grant, Evelyn, Martin, and Caleb. The memo would force the choice out of private meetings and into governance. It would also mark me as the person delaying the company's most important launch. I sent it. Grant called 11 minutes later. You escalated this to Priority 1? Yes. Without telling me you plan to trigger board visibility? The protocol is automatic. That is not an answer. It is the procedure you approved. For a moment, I heard only his breathing. I have protected your role here, Nora. I looked at the coffee cup on my shelf. I thought my work protected my role. That is not how companies function at this level. He ended the call. The following Monday, Martin invited me to a leadership alignment conversation. Evelyn was already seated when I arrived. Martin placed a page in front of me. It listed ineffective collaboration, resistance to business priorities, inappropriate escalation, and failure to produce a viable launch path. It was a 30-day development plan requiring weekly coaching and solution-oriented alternatives before I raised another Priority 1 issue. If I accepted, they could say I acknowledged performance problems. If I refused, they could say I rejected coaching. If I certified the launch, the issue disappeared. If I did not, I became the issue. That night, I checked one provision in the Harbor National Agreement. It named me as LatticePay's independent control owner. If I became unavailable during an open Priority 1 exception, authority transferred temporarily to the audit committee. The exception stayed active until a qualified successor resolved it, and the bank acknowledged the decision. The clause existed because Grant had wanted Harbor to see that risk authority did not depend on one personality. He had called it institutional maturity. I printed the provision and placed it in my desk. 2 days later, Caleb brought me a continuity chart. My name was at the top. His sat beneath it. Grant asked me to confirm I could assume signatory authority, he said. And can you? Operationally, yes. That is not what I asked. He looked toward the door. The role transfers, the judgment does not. Are you planning to sign the full certification? I am planning to follow the procedure attached to the role. It sounded evasive. You learned that sentence in one of Martin's meetings? His eyes hardened. No, I learned it from you. He left the chart and walked out. For the next week, Grant stopped speaking to me directly. Requests came through Evelyn. Questions came through Martin. Product decisions arrived as completed slides. The day before the deadline, Grant presented Pulse Advance to the board. I attended because RA 17 required the control owner to be present. Ruth Calder, chair of the audit committee, sat at the far end. She had spent 20 years in commercial banking and had no patience for inflated language. Grant described the model as fully tested across representative merchant segments. Ruth looked at me. Do you agree? 6 board members, 3 executives, and an observer from Redmarsh waited. I could have softened the answer. Instead, I said, no. The seasonal segment has not been validated for the proposed limits. Can the product launch at any scale? Ruth asked. Yes. 40,000 merchants, reduced limits, weekly review. And at 120,000? Not on the current record. The investor observer closed his notebook. Grant did not shout. He thanked the board, advanced the slide, and finished as if I had corrected a footnote. That restraint frightened me more than anger would have. The next morning, Evelyn sent a calendar invitation titled Quarter-End Review. At 9:03, my access to the investor folder was removed. At 10:17, Human Resources asked me to confirm my home address. At 11:40, the final certification package went to Caleb. By noon, I knew. I spent the afternoon preparing a transition. Not because I was surrendering. The risk program did not belong to me. My analysts still had work to do. The bank still needed accurate reporting. Merchants would still be affected by decisions made after I left. I updated RA 17, listed each unresolved condition, and added the harbor succession provision. Then, I wrote one instruction for the next signatory. Assumption of role does not constitute resolution of open exceptions. Any certification must state scope, limitations, and reliance. I sent it to Caleb at 3:31. He replied at 3:36. Received. At 4:44, I placed the paper coffee cup in my handbag and walked to conference room B. Grant sat at the head. Martin had a folder open. Evelyn had no notebook. That told me the decision was final. Nora, Grant began, we have concluded that your leadership approach is no longer aligned with the company's needs. The digital clock read 4:46. Martin said my employment would end that day. I would receive salary through the notice period, accrued leave, and a proposed severance package. What is the stated basis? I asked. Performance and loss of confidence, Grant said. Because I would not certify Pulse Advance? Because you failed to translate risk concerns into executable solutions. I provided a staged launch. You provided an outcome that missed the company objective. I turned to Evelyn. Do you agree? She looked at me. I agree the relationship is no longer functional. It allowed everyone to hear a different meaning. Martin pushed the folder across the table. The offer included 6 months of salary, continued benefits, a neutral reference, and my annual bonus at target. In exchange, I would release claims, avoid disparaging statements, return all records, and assist with bank and investor questions for 12 months. They wanted my silence and my credibility. Who will sign the certification? I asked. That is no longer your responsibility, he said. At 4:56, Human Resources collected my badge and phone. I signed only the property receipt. At 4:58, Martin stated the effective time of termination. Grant stood. I am sorry it ended this way. I believed he was sorry. Not for firing me, for needing to do it himself. The elevator doors opened. Caleb stood inside, holding the certification packet. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Did you know? I asked. His face was pale. Yes. How long? Since Monday. And you said nothing. I could not. You chose not to. The elevator alarm sounded because the doors had stayed open too long. I am sorry, Nora, he said. The doors closed between us. That was the scene I misunderstood until the end. At 5:06, Ruth opened Grant's deleted email. Grant had sent it at 4:43 to Martin and Evelyn with the subject, RA17 transition. At 4:52, he deleted it from his sent folder. The override protocol copied it to the audit vault because it referenced an active Priority 1 exception. Terminate Nora effective 4:58. Revoke her authority before the 5 o'clock certification. Caleb can assume the role and sign. Once Nora is no longer the designated control owner, the exception dies with her. We should be clean for the investor call Monday. Ruth opened it because the audit committee received an alert whenever an executive directive altered ownership of an unresolved Priority 1 issue. Grant had approved that alert 2 years earlier. At 5:09, Ruth called Martin. At 5:11, she called Grant. At 5:14, she called Caleb. No one called me. I was sitting in the parking garage with the severance folder on the passenger seat and the paper cup in my lap. The ink had faded where my fingers touched it. I should tell you I felt powerful because I knew the archive would preserve an RA17 directive. I did not. I felt discarded. Systems are cold comfort when people you trusted have just described your judgment as a performance failure. At 7:05, Ruth called. Nora, have you retained company records? No. Sent anything to a personal account? No. Grant never discussed the succession clause with me. I need you for a board interview tomorrow morning. I no longer work for LatticePay. That is part of what we need to discuss. The interview began at 9 o'clock Saturday. Ruth attended with 2 directors and outside counsel. Grant, Martin, and Evelyn were absent. They asked me to walk through RA17. I described the model results, conditional validation, proposed population change, staged launch, development plan, and termination. I did not speculate about motives. I did not call anyone dishonest. I answered what I knew and marked what I did not. Outside counsel shared Grant's deleted email on the screen. The words were ordinary. That made them damaging. No profanity, no confession. Just a plan built on the assumption that governance belonged to whoever occupied a chair. I explained deletion could not separate decisions from the record. Ruth asked why Grant believed the exception would die when my employment ended. I do not know. Did you explain the procedure to him? Twice. Once when the board approved it, and again when Harbor added the succession language. At the end, Ruth told me Pulse Advance expansion was on hold. We will contact you Monday, she said. By Monday morning, Grant had begun his counterattack. Leadership received a message stating I had left after a prolonged disagreement about operating pace and leadership approach. It did not mention termination, RA17, or the deleted email. Redmarsh asked whether the change affected its investment. Grant said succession planning was complete and certification remained on track. Martin sent me a revised severance agreement, 9 months of salary, bonus above target, a statement that my departure was mutual. In return, The confidentiality language became more specific. I could not disclose internal governance matters to investors, clients, employees, or the public except through formal process. It was also designed to purchase a clean narrative. At 9:30, Evelyn asked to meet at a coffee shop near my house. She arrived without a laptop and did not touch her tea. I approved the performance plan, she said. I know. I also approved the termination recommendation. You should know why. Grant told the board you threatened to withhold all certification, even for a limited launch. He said you were using the exception process to force a promotion decision. That is false. I know that now. You were in the meeting when I proposed 40,000 merchants. Yes. Then you knew it then. I knew what you said. I did not know he had told Ruth you planned to withdraw the proposal, unless you were named Chief Risk Officer. The paper cup. The private conversations about the CRO role. My insistence on board visibility. Grant had arranged the pieces so my integrity looked like leverage. Until then, I believed he fired me only to remove a control obstacle. He had spent weeks preparing the board to interpret every action I took as a personal campaign. Why tell me? I asked. Because the deleted email changed what I believed about his motive. Before that, I thought you had lost perspective as a leader. Did Caleb agree to sign? I asked. Grant said he did. Evelyn slid a folded sheet toward me. My notes from the meeting where Grant described your promotion demand. I did not touch it. Those concern company business. Give them to the board through counsel. You may need them, then preserve them properly. I pushed the paper back. That choice cost me leverage but protected me later. I would not become the person Grant was already describing. I was wrong about you. No, you were willing to be uncertain about me when certainty would have been inconvenient. That afternoon, the board removed Grant from decisions involving Pulse Advance. He remained CEO. Boards do not remove chief executives because one email looks bad. Grant argued that he used careless shorthand. He said he believed the exception was tied to my signatory authority, not erased in substance. He said the 4:58 timing created a clear transition before the deadline. To the board, the situation was no longer a simple retaliation story. It was a governance failure inside an executive relationship that had clearly deteriorated. Grant's counsel proposed a controlled solution. The board would confirm my severance, revise my record to leadership disagreement, keep Grant out of the model review, and appoint an independent consultant. Redmarsh would receive a summary, not the details. It also treated me as already gone and best left gone. Ruth called Tuesday evening. The board will correct your personnel record and honor the enhanced severance. What will the record say? That your departure was not for misconduct and your judgment was made in good faith. Will the performance concerns be withdrawn? They will be described as unsubstantiated for purposes of separation. That is not the same thing. It is meaningful language. It is careful language. Boards use careful language. What happens to RA 17? Independent review. And Grant? Restricted from the decision. Temporarily. Yes. What are you asking me to do? Accept the agreement. Participate in the review. Help us stabilize the company. The request was not unreasonable. 312 employees had not fired me. My team deserved stability. But the agreement would allow the board to treat the problem as a conflict between two executives rather than a failure of governance. That night, I read the severance agreement at my kitchen table. 9 months of salary would give me time. The bonus would protect my family. The neutral reference would preserve my career. Signing was easy to justify. I had done my duty. The board had the evidence. The product was paused. Then I read the cooperation clause again. LatticePay could require me to support communications with Harbor National. They wanted the bank to hear my voice after my judgment had been labeled a performance problem. I could not do that. At 10:18, I wrote to Ruth and Martin. I will cooperate with an independent review. I will not sign an agreement that lets the company rely on my credibility while preserving an inaccurate performance record. Any resolution must withdraw the stated performance basis, disclose the leadership transition, and open exception to Harbor National, and preserve audit committee authority under the succession provision. Then I added one sentence. I am not requesting reinstatement. That sentence cost me the clearest path back to status, income, and the role I had spent years preparing to hold. I sent it. By Thursday, Red Marsh had delayed its investment meeting. Harbor National requested formal notice of the leadership change and open exception. Caleb became the designated control owner at 4:58. If he signed a clean certification at 5 o'clock, Grant could argue that the independent risk function reached a different conclusion after I left. I assumed Caleb had signed. He had stood in the elevator holding the packet. He admitted knowing about my termination. He agreed to take the role. For 4 days, he did not contact me. 1 week after the firing, Ruth asked me to attend a special board session. Grant sat in the boardroom with Martin. Evelyn sat 2 chairs away. Caleb was at the far end beside Ruth. We are here to resolve whether RA-17 remained active after Nora's termination, whether the certification was valid, and whether the CEO compromised the independence required by our bank agreement. I accept that my email was poorly worded. I do not accept that I intended to erase a substantive issue. I intended to change accountable ownership before a deadline. Ruth looked at Caleb. Did you assume ownership? Yes. Did you sign the certification? Yes. Grant's shoulders lowered. Then Ruth asked, What did you certify? Caleb opened the packet. The certification was not the document Grant believed he had authorized. At 5:02, 4 minutes after I was fired, Caleb signed a qualified succession certification. It stated that he accepted temporary responsibility for continuity. RA-17 remained unresolved. The model was supportable only for 40,000 merchants, and broader launch required audit committee approval and harbor acknowledgement. He attached my transition instruction. He also selected the contract field marked Material Change in Independent Risk Leadership. That selection automatically notified Harbor National and transferred launch authority to the board. You told me you would sign. I did sign. You knew what I meant. Caleb's voice stayed quiet. I knew what the role required. Martin instructed me not to discuss the transition. Coordination after notice of termination could have been characterized as undermining management. I believed the safest way to protect the record was to follow Nora's written procedure exactly. The elevator scene changed meaning while he spoke. His silence had not been loyalty to Grant. It had been loyalty to the process I taught him, applied in the only way that could not be dismissed as personal allegiance. The role transfers. The judgment does not. Ruth placed 3 records on the screen: Grant's deleted email, Caleb's qualified certification, and the contract minutes from 2 years earlier. Removing an individual must never remove the issue. Authority should transfer upward until independence is restored. Grant had not merely approved the clause. He argued for it when it reassured Harbor and strengthened his position in the contract negotiation. Later, under pressure, he behaved as if the safeguard were a technicality he could outrun by 2 minutes. I chose to document the exception and prepare an honest transition when I believed the company was discarding me. Those decisions made the firing irrelevant to the risk question and decisive to the governance question. The board can debate whether Nora's leadership style was sustainable. We cannot debate whether you attempted to use her termination to change the treatment of an open exception before a contractual deadline. I was protecting the company's financing, Grant said. You placed it at greater risk, Ruth replied, and you represented succession to the investor before confirming what the successor certified. You could have handled this internally. I did, I said. The system worked exactly as you approved it. The board moved into executive session. I waited with Caleb in a smaller room. Why accept the role? Because if I refused, they would find someone who thought signing meant agreeing. I could have broken instruction and created a different risk. I chose the record. The board removed Grant's authority over product, risk, bank, and investor communications. He would remain on paid administrative status while the board negotiated a supervised resignation. Pulse Advance would launch to 40,000 merchants with reduced limits and weekly bank review. Redmarsh would delay investment until the governance assessment was complete. My personnel record would state that I was terminated after a disagreement over risk certification, that the board later adopted my professional judgment, and that the performance basis had been withdrawn. I would receive the bonus I had earned and 6 months of salary without a confidentiality clause that blocked formal cooperation. Then the board offered me reinstatement as Chief Risk Officer. The title Grant wrote on a paper cup was finally real. "You earned the role," she said. "I earned consideration before I was fired. That is not the same as wanting it now. The company needs someone who understands what happened. What it needs is a board willing to remember what happened after the urgency fades." The archive caught one email. The clause stopped one launch. Neither explains why so many people found it easier to question my motive than test Grant's claim. "I will support a 90-day transition as an external advisor," I said. "I will help Caleb, Harbor, and the review. I will not return as an employee." "You are walking away from the CRO role. I am choosing not to let the worst week of my career decide the next 5 years." Vindication did not restore trust. A title could not make the conference room harmless again. Money could not change that Evelyn doubted me. Caleb withheld the truth. Martin built a record around a deadline. And Ruth first looked for compromise before the full answer. Grant resigned 12 days later under board supervision. LatticePay described it as a leadership transition following a governance review. He was not arrested. The company did not collapse. Employees did not march out behind me. Redmarsh did not disappear forever. LatticePay lost a quarter of momentum, paid for an independent review, and renegotiated parts of the investment. Grant lost the succession path he had tried to accelerate and left without the expanded authority he expected. Evelyn remained CFO. Before my advisory period began, she proposed a new rule requiring audit committee review before any performance action against an independent control officer during an open Priority 1 exception. Losses remained within range. The seasonal segment performed poorly enough to justify the limits, and well enough to show the model could be improved rather than abandoned. 6 months later, Harbor approved broader expansion after the validation conditions were resolved. The product was not evil. Grant's ambition was not evil. Speed was not evil. The betrayal happened when he decided removing the person who carried the warning was easier than carrying the warning into the next room. After my advisory period, I accepted a role at a smaller financial cooperative that partnered with regional technology companies. The salary was lower than LatticePay's offer. The title was less impressive than Chief Risk Officer. I could build governance before growth made everyone afraid of it. On my first day, I placed the old paper cup on a shelf in my new office. I kept it as a reminder that someone else's handwriting should never become the measure of my career. 3 months later, I saw Grant at an industry conference. He stood alone near the back of a ballroom. "I heard the broader launch was approved," he said. "So the model was not as dangerous as you believed." There was no anger in his voice, only the old need to make the outcome support his original decision. "I never said it was dangerous at every scale. I said the evidence did not support your scale. You got what you wanted." "No," I said. "I got an accurate record." He gave a small nod, as if he finally understood that the difference mattered to me, even if it never would to him. For years, I believed professional integrity meant being the person who would not change an answer under pressure. It meant building systems that protected the answer when you were no longer in the room. And sometimes, it meant walking away from the title you once wanted, because receiving it after betrayal would make the betrayal the center of your future. Grant fired me at 4:58 because he believed authority lived in a person. 8 minutes later, the board opened his deleted email and discovered authority had already moved beyond him. Not because I planned revenge, because I had done the unglamorous work of making sure the truth could survive a change in personnel. And I left with something more durable than the job I lost: the certainty that professional dignity does not depend on remaining useful to the people who benefit from ignoring it. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the chief risk officer role after the board corrected the record? Or would you have walked away too?